totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Subscribe and follow on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Links to all the social media sites at bookedonrock.com. And of course, you can hear the podcast on pretty much any podcast platform. Spotify, Apple, iHeart, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spreaker, YouTube. You'll find Booked on Rock. Author Stephen Shaiken is our guest to talk about his rock and roll novel titled Queensborough Rock. Queensborough Rock is the story of a young struggling rock and roll manager, Jack Bernstein, who lives in New York City. It's the year 1971. Jack doesn't have a fancy office in Manhattan. He doesn't have a flashy car and backstage passes. Instead, he works out of a basement apartment in working-class Queens and drives around looking for hidden talent in a beat-down Volvo. The talent he does steal gets stolen by Manhattan agents he calls sharks. To finance a demo tape for his top talent, he had to borrow from a loan shark and pawn a friend's guitar. But the tape fails to land a deal, and Jack is running out of chances. His last hope is an offer from a friendly Queens mobster. Jack is asked to manage his obnoxious nephew as best as he can. If he does, doors will open. Stephen is a veteran writer of fiction, both short stories and novels, and he says all of his work is based on his life, places he's been, and events he's witnessed. And as you'll find out, he's lived quite a life. So what was it that inspired his latest book, Queensborough Rock? You're about to find out. Here is Stephen Shaiken. Stephen, welcome to the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. Your website says you were born and raised in New York City. Tell us about where you grew up and what led you to a career as a writer of fiction.
I was born in Brooklyn, and when I was about 5, we moved to a place in Queens called Maspeth. In the book, it's referred to as Macbeth Heights. Obviously, I didn't love it very much. It's the Archie Bunkie neighborhood. I'm fonder of it now because it's given me things to write about. And I was fortunate enough to get into a really great high school, Stuyvesant High School in New York City. It was meant to train the scientists and doctors of the world, but my goal in going there was it was in Manhattan and I could go to Greenwich Village all the time. And I really loved it. I wasn't the greatest student, but I managed to get into City University, Queens College, where I majored in history. In my senior year, I had to fill up, your curriculum. I would run out of all the required. I started taking fiction writing and poetry courses and fell in love with them. Graduated college and drew a very good number in the draft and knew I wasn't going to be drafted. I did what every self-respecting college graduate did. I embarked on like a 6-month tour of Europe and Morocco, came back and decided now I'm qualified to be a writer. I've traveled the world. I applied to San Francisco State University, which had a very good creative writing program. They had 2 wonderful writers who aren't known now as they should be. They were award-winning stellar writers in their days, Kay Boyle and Wright Morris, and they taught me how to write. But I forgot a lot of it because people told me, you can't make a living as a writer, be a lawyer. And when I was in the creative writing course, one of the teachers invited a very famous, very radical lawyer named Charles Gary. He was the Black Panthers lawyer. He was an old Armenian American. He didn't take anything from anybody. He was what you think of as a criminal lawyer. And I watched him and I said, this is what I want to do. I know the people that are telling me to be a lawyer want me to sit in an office and, draft up contracts about bankruptcy and the fur trade and stuff like that. But this is what I want to do. So I went to Brooklyn Law School and got a job at Legal Aid in Brooklyn. Loved it. And for reasons, that we never understand the minds of young people, I decided that now that I had developed somewhat of ties and, familiarity with the New York City criminal defense bar, why not move to the other side of the country and start all over again, which I did and had a wonderful 35 years living in the Bay Area of San Francisco, practicing criminal defense and immigration defense law. In 2015, my wife survived stage 4 cancer, the 3rd time she had it. And I decided life is too short to worry about anything but living day to day. And we went off and spent 3 years. She's from the Philippines, but Thailand's a nicer place to live, in our opinion. So we lived there for 3 years, got into a writing group, started doing what I really wanted to do. And as a result of that writing group and my being in Thailand, I produced 4 what I call the NJA Club series novels. Now, after writing that, I decided I want to do something else. And coincidentally, at that time, I was looking through boxes that I hadn't unpacked when I moved from California to Florida, and found a manuscript of probably about 40 pages, which became Queensborough Rock. And I was astonished because what I found was a handwritten draft with crossings out and writing over it, then a typewritten draft. This is how you did it in those days. We didn't have then corrections on that, then another typewritten draft. And I said, I read it. And of course, from having read my bio, as I told one of my friends when he said, wait a minute, I remember that. I don't remember you getting all the girls. I said, my friend, in my book, I get all the girls. That's but I took it off, and we had now 40 pages that were written in 1974, right after I was finished, in between going to graduate school for writing and law school, and put it down. And so much has changed. I've changed. My worldview has changed. Writing styles have changed. And I took it from there and spent, like the next year and a half or 2 years working on that book. And That's how I ended up here.
Had you forgotten about the book when you found it? Did you forget?
I knew I had. Well, I mean, if you had asked me, I would have said, yes, I remember, but it wasn't like on the front of when you're a writer and you're studying writing, you write every day,
Right,
you have boxes of stuff, every musicians have tapes of songs that'll never be released. And I knew I'd written it, but it didn't seem until I picked it up and saw it and realized, holy mackerel, I've actually written and the first part of the book was probably the truest of all. After that, everything else just became pure imagination, but not pure imagination, but imagination based on fact. But the first visit to Luna Records really happened. That's exactly how it was.
Yeah, that's the opening scene.
Yeah.
So that's a great story. But also what I love is it's never too late to pursue your passion, your dream.
Never too late. I mean, that's an important thing to recognize. We've heard about that guy, I forgot his name. I think it's Rodriguez, a man who in his 70s, he discovered that Pisa was a Latino-American person living in American Detroit. And he'd done a few garage tapes when he was in his 20s, and 50 years later, someone in South Africa discovered it. They loved it. Next thing you know, he's packing venues in South Africa in his 70s.
What were the bands and the artists that you followed growing up in New York?
Interesting. Someone else just asked me about that. They said to me, why is it that you New Yorkers weren't great Elvis Presley fans? Now, we didn't dislike him, of course, but I said, very simple. I grew up, in the 50s and 60s. That was when what they called race music, which is music by African Americans, was hardly ever played unless it was sort of like Johnny Mathis or Nat King Cole, great artists who played for that audience. But we had a station called WWRL. Now, when you could listen to Little Richard and all the great African American groups, I mean, Elvis, when you were at Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters all the time, Howlin' Wolf, all the great. I loved Howlin' Wolf. That's
what a voice. What a voice.
What a man. To what I'm treated as musicians the right way. So we heard that stuff. I loved, R&B and soul, and obviously it's in the book. But I probably in the early 60s, I was a young kid then, but 12, 13, 14, I was really into folk music. I loved Bob Dylan and Phil Oakes and Tom Paxton, and not so much Peter, Paul, and Mary. I wanted rougher, I liked the real original. And then I just like all music, I love psychedelic music. I'm still a Deadhead to this day.
Nice. Fellow Deadhead. All right.
I listen to them every day of my life, and of course the beat. I mean, if it's rock, I like rock. I like the music that stems from R&B and blues and country, folk. I I'm not into popular music so much. You could get that. We ridicule, but if people like it, more power to them.
Yeah, I got a picture of Jerry right here. I'm looking at him now.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you, what's your favorite Dead song? Do you have one?
Yes, it's an easy one, and it's because it's the only Dead song I really learned how to play well, and that's Ripple. I'm an amateur
Ripple?
guitarist.
Yeah.
And when you're an amateur guitarist, you judge songs by whether you can play them.
Yeah. Well, actually, this past weekend, my older brother's a big Dead fan. Had a St. Patty's party, and we were playing some Dead. And Wharf Rat came up. I said, "That's my favorite. I love Wharf Rat."
They're all great.
As a writer, you must appreciate the lyrics.
Oh, that's one I was going to tell you, because Robert Hunter was asked, what, in your opinion, is the greatest line you ever wrote? And I'm listening, waiting there, like listening, as if I was one of the disciples listening to Jesus, or, and like he says, it was, let it be known there is a fountain that was not made by the hands of man. That's from Ripple. And I said, that's fantastic. It is a great, I actually like the next line better. There is a road, no simple highway between the dark and the edge of dawn. And if you go, nobody can follow. This path was made for your steps alone. Very Buddhist.
Yeah. Robert Hunter and Jerry Garcia. Wow. What a team. What a team.
What a team.
They talked about, what was it? Terrapin Station, the title track. They both, the night before, there was a lightning storm in San Fran, and Robert sees it and starts writing lyrics. Next morning, he calls Jerry. He goes, "I got some great lyrics, man. I was writing him to the big lightning storm last night." And Jerry goes, "Are you kidding me?" He goes, "I looked up at that lightning storm and I just came up with some music." And they came together.
When
they read each other's minds.
There was a team like Elton John and Bernie Taupin. You can't separate them. And when I lived in California, I lived in Marin County. Most of the Dead members lived there. We saw them all the time. In fact, it played a role in my moving. You say, why? Because I'm a Deadhead. I love the Dead. I especially love Phil Lesh, the greatest bass player of any jam band ever. He's also an accomplished musician who can play all kinds of instruments.
Yeah.
But he wanted to open up a nightclub to be called Terrapin Landing. And it would have only so many shows a year. And I lived in Fairfax, California. And when I moved there, I loved it. As I used to say, welcome to Fairfax, where it's always 1968. That was what it was like. But it changed over the years. So in 2015, Phil Lesh says, I want to buy this old grocery store and turn it into a nightclub. We'll only have like 12, 13 shows a year, but they're going to be great shows. And I will donate money to the community and I'll give free concerts. And I'm thinking, well, this is Fairfax. Let's roll. When do I help roll out the red carpet? But no, people, it had changed. It was now a bunch of yuppies. They said, we don't want the traffic. We don't want the noise. And they went to Phil Lesh's house and picketed in front of his house. And I turned to my wife and said, Josie, when our neighbors are picketing Phil Lesh, I have to move.
That's a story I've never heard. Well, you've heard it now. Yeah, he plays, I think he's still playing because he's now in his 70s, I would say, maybe
80s. He just turned 83.
Yeah, at the Portchester Theater the Capitol Theater in Portchester, New York. He plays, a few times a year, maybe more, but
with different groups forward. I can't keep track of them. It doesn't matter as long as there's one Dead there. That's going to be a good show.
Absolutely. What about novelists growing up? Who were the ones you looked to for inspiration or that you really love to read?
Well, let me see. I read so much. When I was young, I'd say when I got into high school, I started to read the American authors who went over to Paris. And Kay Boyle, my teacher, she had married an American diplomat. If you ever read about Got Time to Read a Fascinating Life, she was actually working for the underground during World War II. I'm an amazing woman. And I hadn't met her at this point, but it only made it more amenable to be my mentor. I loved reading Hemingway. I know he's out of fashion these days because he's considered a sexist, but that's got nothing to do with writing. And Fitzgerald, who was the exact opposite, but John Dos Passos. One guy I could never get into is William Faulkner. My writer friends, I just say, look, he's a great writer. Doesn't like with music, right? So those people. And then I started reading some foreign readers, some, like Boris Pasternak and Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn came out later in the late 60s, early 70s. But of course, the writer that really changed everybody's life in that generation, there were three of them really, Joseph Heller, but also Kurt Vonnegut. I mean, he changed the way I looked at literature. It's okay. Let all these, even my teachers that I loved and respected, dumped on him all the time. And I used to say, you sound like my father saying, you call this music? Now, Tommy Dorsey, that was music. Actually, my father was more open-minded than that. I'm just giving it, but those were the ones that I probably loved the most, aside from science fiction, which doesn't count because when you're a science fiction fan, you don't even distinguish, you read anything,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
remember the books, the two sides, you'd flip them over, there'd be a novel on each side.
Do you build a book around a character and add the rest of the storyline, or is it the reverse? Do you think of a certain period, a location, or a topic, and then you create characters around it?
I generally start with one character and think about the situation I'll put him in. And once you've done that, as you start introducing new characters, once you get a little experience in writing, those new characters know what to do, or more than you know what to do with them. So
Okay.
the answer would be start, whether you pick your story first or your character first, I don't think matters as much, but you've got to have that character. And he or she will be the center of, from my standpoint. Others do it differently.
Oh, yeah. Everybody's got their style. In fact, I remember asking recently authors, what's the best time of day or night or year that they're the most creative? Things just pour out of them. Do you have any?
Yes, early in the morning.
It's
And
morning.
I began that practice when I was in Thailand, and I've just kept it going. It doesn't mean you can't do other stuff at other times. You can rewrite and make corrections and stuff. But for me, that's just me. Somebody else would say I can only write late at night after every. I just find I've got more energy and I just feel more into it.
I would imagine too, you have those times where you have to put it down because you feel like you're going mad over every little detail.
That happens. You say, yes. The hardest thing is, when do you say this book is done?
Yeah.
Now, when you're an independent author, it's different than a public. Independent author, you think, are there any typos? That's a whole, you learn. I went through a whole experience of learning that just because someone says they're a proofreader doesn't mean they are. They're just doing basically, some of them are just doing what you do on spell check. And about spell check creates. I would say that, I worry about that. And you can go crazy. And you could say, how many more times will I read it? I've had a proofreader look at it. I've had an editor read it. At a certain point, you got to let go. And that, unfortunately, as you just indicated, that tension point could come up before the book is finished. You're in the middle of it and you say, I've gotten to the point now that I try to follow a rule that was given to me, which I ignored, which is don't go back and rewrite as you're writing. Finish the book and then go back and do the rewriting. Sometimes it's not possible because you realize when you're in the middle of a book, wait a minute, what I'm doing now is inconsistent with something I said earlier. So you have to decide, do you change it right then, or do you make a note of it and go back and do it later on? In that instance, I say go back and fix it up right away, because there's no guarantee you'll remember it or understand your little scribbled notes or whatever.
All of your books self-published? Do you mix it up? Do you have publishers help?
And not publishers. I mean, if I had a publisher, I wouldn't be using any of the other people. But in fact, I'm not even looking. I've given, at my age, I'm 73. I do not want to spend a year looking for an agent and then they spend 2 years. It's not important to me. This is more important to me. Just people read it and
Absolutely.
talk about it.
Yeah, and make
But
it
I will
connect.
say this. The first book, I had a writing group in Bangkok that was wonderful and really helped me incredibly. I used proofreaders that weren't that good. I had to go back and hire better proofreaders. The second book, I hired great proofreaders. The third book, and fourth books, I hired editors. And it made a huge difference. The fifth one, when I went to talk to an editor, she said, this thing is, I had two very skilled beta readers look at the book for me. And it was the fourth book in my series, it becomes easier. When I went to an editor, she said, you know what, there really isn't a whole lot of editing I got to do. Why don't I just charge you as a glorified proofreader? And if I see something that needs editing, I'll make a note. I said, who's going to argue with that? So, I don't have a publisher, but I try to bring with me all the resources you would get, which is I have a very good cover designer. I believe the only reason I sell, I don't want to demean myself, one reason why I sell a few books almost every day in my Bangkok series, and I hear other writers don't do that. And that's not, selling a handful of books is not exactly, threatening, Stephen King, but it's pretty good in the independent world. I think it's because the covers are good. I think people buy, that's what I think. So I'm very happy with the cover designers and the formatters and the proofreaders. That's the stuff that you get when you have a publisher. And the beautiful thing about self-publishing now is you can do it all. And just as there are more and more writers, there are more and more of these experts, their prices are coming down.
And also, just obviously, you're a great guest, so you can sell. You can go out there. You don't need somebody behind you to help push the book. If you're outgoing and you're a good speaker, you're in a good spot. You're in a good spot. If you're somebody who's more reserved, quiet, you don't really want to do all that stuff, well, then maybe, you need somebody to help with it.
And the truth is that you can do the kind of promotion that you need help with, the kind that you're talking about, only you can do it yourself. Give a talk, go and meet people, wherever you are, try and let in that you're a writer. I'm pretty politically active too. And whenever I go around, I sort of slip and I go, well, when I'm not doing this, I'm out there writing fiction books that nobody reads. And everybody's like, how come I never heard of you? I said, well, I told you wouldn't believe how many people say, go online and get your book. I mean, just because they met you and they thought it was funny.
Absolutely.
But you can pretty cheaply promote yourself, through like social media. You got to be careful. Everybody and their brother or sister has opened up a company that will promote your books. I'd say 99% of them will sell 0 books for you. 95% will serve 0 books for you, sell 0 books. And the ones that are good will sell books for you, but they won't just sell the books. They'll get your image of your cover and stuff out there. And I think that when people see it repeatedly, they begin to say, holy mackerel, this book by Shaiken, I'm seeing it everywhere. So he must be really good.
Yep, that's like old school vinyl albums, walking through a record store. Hey, that looks good.
Right.
So, let's talk about Queensborough Rock. What is the plot?
Sure. The plot was that young Jack Bernstein really wants to make it as a manager in the rock business at an era when that was a pretty attractive and it was possible to do it and young guys were doing it. The problem is that he doesn't really have the resources to get into the places where you can do it, Manhatten, and get to go backstage and meet all the big people. He's broke. He's living in a basement apartment, driving a crummy old car. And a la Broadway Danny Rose, the great Woody Allen movie, whenever he does come up with some talent, a big operation steals it. And now he's really got his back to the wall because he shot his wad, in a manner of speaking, on this demo tape. And let me say, that part is true, that I didn't go to a gangster, although I knew the gangster, the Malone Shark. I knew that guy, but I didn't go. My mother would have killed me, so I didn't go to him. And I never pawned a guitar, but I have many friends who did pawn guitars that didn't belong to them. So that's all out there. And he owed the money. I didn't owe the money. So when it flopped, when I didn't get a K, it didn't matter to me as much as him. He's got to do something. And the story is about how he manages to solve this nightmare of being in debt to bad guys and also making it as a rock manager in a way that obviously, there's got to be a flaw in everybody. He winds up sort of becoming the people that he didn't want to be. Once you get a taste of that money and that fame, you begin to see what Crumpert and Duke Reingold were telling him is eventually what, rightly or wrongly, it's what the music business is about.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is a lot of the book, or at least some of the book, as you say. You walked in Jack's shoes over 50 years ago. You managed an artist. You had a demo tape made. You even got some prominent labels to give it a listen. Can you tell us who that artist was? And where are they now?
I'll tell you.
Where is that artist?
He is a wonderful human being.
Is he singing for the Rolling Stones? Be honest.
No, he is not.
No, he's not Mick Jagger.
No, and you will see why the book came out the way it did. His name is Gabriel Halpern. He runs a yoga school called the Yoga Circle in Chicago. He's one of the, I have been in very loose communication with him. He followed his dream. He didn't want to be a rock star. He wanted to be a yogi, and he became one of the most loved and respected yogis in the world. And I didn't see it. Maybe if I could go back, I'd look for one of those companies and say, I got a guy for you. But many of his songs, not many, some of his songs have been recorded, and he's just a great person. He lived the dream. He's doing, even though he's got to live in Chicago, but he's doing what he wants to do, and he's having a big impact on people's lives in a great way.
So he's written songs. Did he write songs that other artists recorded?
Yes. In fact, there's an interesting story. I'll take 1 second to tell. Like the only difference in the book is that the tape was recorded in and listened to with the record company that was Buddha Records that I called Luna, which was a big company back then. But everything else took place in California because the artist moved to California and the manager had to follow him. So all the shows and everything and a lot of other auditions took place in California. But I wanted to make it about New York. So I just, you can change that. He was very, very clear all the way through that I'm, just like in the book, I'm going to sing this stuff. And I just didn't see that there was a market for it. But there's no animosity. What do you, guy wants to become a yogi, devoting like to yoga? It's a good thing. It's not a bad thing.
So you were a rock manager, 1970, 1971. What comes to mind when you think back on those years working in the city?
Well, I enjoyed the part of being in the city and doing the recording. That's all recorded there. I mean, I think about the intensity of New York and just how interesting it was to be there at that time. But when Gabriel moved to California and I followed him, I actually liked that more because we were doing a lot of gigging then. And so when I think about what was it like to be a rock manager, I think about, first of all, eating a lot of free pizza and drinking beer because he performed it a lot. And also occasionally being able to open for a more serious performer and getting to like go backstage and actually meet some of these people. And what I was about to tell you is that through his songwriting, we sold a song to a group called Shanti. Shanti was made up of some American musicians and a guy named Ali Akbar Khan, Zakir Hussain, who was the relative of a famous tabla player named Khan, and he's now a world famous tabla player. It was like a group that mixed Eastern, and they had a sitar player and the tabla player, and they loved one of our guys' songs and they bought it. And one day they came to me and they said, look, besides being a rock manager, because they were all my age, they didn't know any better, are you also a roadie? I said, of course. And you know how to set up amps? Sure. They said, great, because we have an audition down in Los Angeles and we need you to drive everything. We're going to be singing your guys' song. You have to come down there. You drive it and you set everything up. So like I'm running around talking to every musician. What do I got to do? It wasn't that hard, really. So I drive down there and they bring us to a nightclub. I go to a nightclub, I'm sitting down there and I'm saying, by the way, I was so naive. I was 21. I said, by the way, who's the audition with? They go, Apple Records. Wow. I go, really? Who's coming? They go, George Harrison. I think they're kidding me. The door opens up. In walks George Harrison. I kid you not. I mean, when he had the beard and the long hair, and he was like not a big guy. I'm nearly dropping dead. And I'm sitting at a table by myself, and him and his entourage come and sit at the same table. I was frozen. A waiter comes along, one of these, this was in LA, I had to drive from San Francisco. One of these obsequious LA waiters comes along and asks all the other people what they want to drink. And Harrison took orange juice. Everybody else took orange juice. He doesn't ask me a thing. I'm the hired help. I'm the guy setting up the stage. And Harrison says, I'll never forget this. He goes, excuse me, you forgot something. And the guy is trembling. What did I forget, Mr. Harrison? You forgot to ask my friend what he wants to drink. That's the kind of guy he was.
Oh, that's so cool.
This was like, you wouldn't think this is one of the most famous, important people. And it was like, hey, this is some guy and he listened. He was very nice. He shook everybody's hands. Did I even think to ask him for an autograph? No. Who cares? The memory is the autograph.
Sure. Sure.
That was,
what year would that have been?
1971.
So
It was the summer of 71.
All Things Must Pass was out by then, right?
Yes, yes. He was not only that, I got another fringe benefit. I remember this, a woman who became a writer, rock and roll writer. You may have heard of her. Her name was Lita Escalou. She's my age now.
It sounds familiar.
She wrote a lot of stuff about that era. She lived on the same block as me in San Anselmo. One day she knocks on my door. She goes, listen, I'm always getting these albums. I go, sure. She goes, because they want me to write reviews. She goes, I got one you want to listen to. I go in, I say, sure, let's put it on the table. It was Imagine by John Lennon. I was one of the first. So while I didn't make a lot of, I didn't make the money that Bernstein made, I have memories that I wouldn't trade for anything.
Yeah, but all those great stories you store away for these books. And that's the thing.
Yeah, someday it'll come back.
Yeah, yeah. And you could tell reading this book that you were a New Yorker. You were there. You lived it. You breathed it. And there's some of these characters I'm curious as to if they're from real people, like Eddie Wayburn, Tennessee Eddie.
One day I was driving over the back from Manhattan with some friends over the Queensborough Bridge. We're driving along Queens Boulevard, right where it happens, and we see a guy with a car that was broken. And he was a guy from Tennessee named Eddie, and he had a dog and he had a guitar. And we gave him a lift to get his battery charged, and that was the last I ever saw of him again. But what kind of a story would that be?
Well, in the book, though, he's one of those stories where he's the one that got away, another one that got away. And Jack, he's a talent, and this is my guy, and all of a sudden he gets eaten up by the big shots. They buy him up, but then his story ends. I don't know how much, we don't want to give away too much.
Yeah, we don't want spoilers, but he gets his comeuppance.
He gets his comeuppance. That's exactly it. But also, you name check so many great places like Max's Kansas City and Queensborough Bridge and all that stuff. And how important is that when you're writing a story like this to really get the specifics? Because you feel like you're in New York City. I mean,
I think I have in some of my promos, I've used the line, only someone who lived it could write this. And I think that's true. That's why I chose to put it in New York. New York's much more interesting to write about than the Bay Area of California, in my perspective, at least from what I saw. There's interesting stuff, but New York is New York. And this was when rock and roll was king. So you can't separate. This couldn't have happened any other place. There are no people like all the characters in that book, except in New York. There's no Vinnie Calamato in San Francisco because there's no mafia in San Francisco. And you just, even as I used to joke with my Italian American friends in California, say, you guys are not real Italians. I grew up with Italians. You are not the real deal. Trust me. It's like New York. Everything is different.
Vinny is a guy. He seems like a cool guy. He's a mobster, but even Jack's just like, oh man, this guy's cool, but he's being warned, like, be careful, because he's being a little.
Well, people are complicated. People are complicated. We don't know if Vinny actually physically hurt people, but he hires people who are there for that purpose, So, but everyone he runs into, he treats it. Jack is constantly being surprised to find out he was moved by the concentration camps, that he's friends with black people. He caters to gay people and protects them. Of course he makes money doing it, but he doesn't have any hangups about that. So although on one hand he's a gangster, he's sort of the most likable guy in the book in another way, really.
Yeah. And this is where the story takes off here, because Vinny has a nephew, Max, and he comes to Jack Bernstein and says, I need you to do me a favor. My nephew, he's a pain in the ass. He can't do anything right. I need you to help, man. I need you to put him in a band, see what you can do with him. And that's where, as I was reading throughout, I'm thinking, oh boy, this isn't going to end well. I was just, if this doesn't pan out with Max, Jack's in trouble.
Well, that's the conflict. That's the tension. Yeah. That's the tension that hopefully keeps people riding through. There's got to be something. You learn that it's hard when people are telling it to you theoretically, and most of the people telling it to you are would-be writers who can't do it themselves. But when they say you've got to have a tension, there's got to be a conflict, there's got to be some reason that you care about what happens on the next page. You learn that as you keep doing it.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Stephen Shaiken here to talk about his novel, Queensborough Rock. Throughout the story, there are moments when a specific song is playing. Now, this might be reading into it too much, but I'm very curious. Like you got Living on a Jet Plane, Peter, Paul, and Mary, or I Had Too Much to Dream Last Night by the Electric Prunes. There was a band. Now, I was just curious if there was a specific reason for the songs you choose to insert along the way. Is the title suggesting something?
Those are the songs I would have been listening to.
Okay.
And I had to go and fact check to make sure that those albums were released when I said Jack was listening to them.
Yes, you had somebody help you out with that too. There's Barry Weissman.
Yes, Barry
Right?
Weissman is a friend of mine that I met when I went out to California to manage the artist. And we've been good friends ever since then. When he was 16 years old, he was in a rock group. He was the drummer, and they opened for the Rascals. And they played in the Acton House.
Yeah.
And so he's he's got a fountainhead of knowledge about music. And he helped me both with some of those songs just to make sure I had it right, although I still had to fact check it, and also about the equipment that was being used. And also because he was a drummer and one of the characters was a drummer, and that was important, I had to ask him a few questions like, would it be realistic if you knew drummers of all types of music? Would like an African-American R&B drummer want to like get in on a gig like this with Max, and Jack? And he said, if he was going to get paid, absolutely. And I realized that was how the guy was going to be. Like, I'm here to make money. I got a family to support. And so he helped me in so many ways. That's why he got an acknowledgement.
I want to ask you about the radio stations too. WNEW, WBAI, the listener-supported FM station. They come up often. And there's a moment where the character is listening to one of the first FM stations. You also mention the DJ, the Nightbird. Jimi Hendrix wrote a song.
Name, Allison Steele.
Right.
That's why I said, you know why? I was so into it. We never said, we called her the Nightbird.
Yes.
Listen to the Nightbird,
Jimi Hendrix wrote Nightbird. Is the song called Nightbird, I think, Jimi Hendrix, the song about her.
She's been written a number of times, and so that's why it didn't dawn on me. But I listened to those stations, and not only that, I knew someone, again, Danny Goldstein is based on a fellow that I knew in college. He probably wouldn't remember me. We went in the city universities. There were fraternities, but we would do cool for fraternity. We had what were called house plans. They were just like a bunch of guys got together, rented out a house, because we all lived at home with our parents. It was a commuter college, and it gave us a place to hang out and bring our girlfriends and do everything we wanted to do that you couldn't do at home. And one of the members was a fellow named Dennis Elsis, and he worked at the college radio station.
Dennis Elsis. Yes, Dennis, of course. Yes.
I mean, we used to hang out together and listen to, we had a jukebox in the house. And I was elected president because my platform was, if elected president, I promise you within 60 days, I will have a jukebox and a Coca-Cola machine in this house. Start small, at least I made this I could keep. And we did it both. And me and Dennis would listen to that stuff. Like I say, I haven't seen him since 1969 or so. He wouldn't know me from a bar. For all I know, he could be home reading Queensborough Rock right now.
He could be. But he ended up on NEW, I think.
He started on PLJ.
Okay.
PLJ then was they changed in the early days. Once the big companies, the big networks saw you could actually make money on FM, they all started being bought out by bigger companies. But in the early days, they were pretty small.
My subscription ran out a while back, but from what I remember, he was on Sirius XM. He was on Deep Tracks, I think. He was on various rock stations.
He is. I listen. I do have. I couldn't live without Sirius XM because when I drive in the car, I don't drive that much anymore. But when I do, I like to listen to music I want to listen to, and you get more of a choice with Sirius XM.
Yeah. So you've heard him. He's still on.
Yeah. Not recently. Cool. But I do listen to Deep Tracks. But as you know, depends on what time yesterday I lucked out and managed to hear Tommy James on the gold, 60s gold.
And the reason I asked the question about all the radio stations that you note throughout the book, it's just it appears as if radio was really important to you growing up.
Yeah, and you could get all the news. I mean, TV was good to watch, for visual, but radio was always around. You could listen to radio when you're sitting in your room. You could listen, radio. They could play it over the loudspeakers in college cafes and stuff like that. It was the way in which music was spread.
How big was the mob back then in New York in terms of music?
I had every single time, it doesn't matter if once you got above the level of performing like in a coffee shop or a pizza joint, and I did get a few times Gal he played in a great place called the Lion's Share, which was a famous nightclub in San Anselmo. The Dead used to show up. I remember regularly going there, and they'd have like Van Morrison and Jack Elliott doing a duo together. Imagine that. I mean, it was just fantastic. Yeah. But I mean, radio was the way in which you heard the artist the first time.
Did the mob get involved with radio? Did they kind of infiltrate that and say,
yes,
hey, you're going to play this song?
What I want to say is when you went to clubs, you saw the mob presence there because they like to hang out there. They like to hang out there. They're not necessarily there to make trouble. They just like going there. Secondly, that nightclubs are great. I was a criminal defense lawyer for decades, right? You don't think I know nightclubs are wonderful ways to launder money? You made $2 million dealing heroin on the streets, and you made $100,000 in the nightclub. You actually may have lost money, but you make it look like you made money because you understand why. You pay some taxes and you look legit, and you avoid a lot of audit. At least they hope so. They were present in the radio business. I mean, I have no doubt, and I think Tommy James of that, part of the reason some records got played more than others was threats. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. No mobster ever approached me. I wasn't important enough, but I was regularly being told that if you ever make it, son, you're going to have to deal with these guys. I never got to find out. And I got to deal with them in a different way as their lawyer,
Vinnie Calamato, it's interesting because he reminded me of the Tony Soprano character. Prior to that, it was like we had this image of the mobster as just all evil, nothing good about him, but it's more complex than that. He is a nice guy. He's doing bad things. It's like, that's what I really liked about the character of Vinny. Is he based on a real person or an image of somebody that?
Yes.
Yeah.
He's based on a guy who went to prison for Teamster Union corruption in other words, using his position with the Teamsters Union to shuffle money to the pension money to the mob. So I guess they could use it to buy drugs and then pay him back. He went to prison for 5 years. And he lived in the neighborhood, and I knew him, and I knew his son. So he just struck me as a good, even though he had nothing to do with the music business. He seemed like if I had to have a mobster that you could sort of like, he seemed like the kind of guy you'd want to have.
Fascinating character. And the main character, of course, Jack, by the end of this book, it's interesting how things turn up. And we were talking before we started recording. I was asking you if there's going to be a sequel in play here, because you could take this character and do so many things with it. I mean, you can even set him in today's world. I mean, what would it be like for him to try to manage a rock and roll band in the year 2023, or just throughout the decades, 80s, 90s?
Yeah, I know you could. I mean, because clearly, as I say, when I got out of law school, I got the dream job that I wanted. Legal Aid Society, criminal defense lawyer. Other people wanted to work in Wall Street. They wouldn't have. I don't think I would have cut it in a corporate firm, assuming they would have taken me. And I loved it. And one of the things I loved about it was that they had night court in New York. And once or twice a month, the younger lawyers had to do the night court arraignments. They'd be from like 5 o'clock to midnight. At midnight, 1 or 2, as many as we can get, we'd hop in a cab, go over the bridge, and go to CBGB's, where by 12:30 things were just starting to warm up, and you would see the greatest bands in the world. Even though the Ramones were already pretty well known by then, but they weren't making any money.
I know, isn't that crazy?
Yeah, I mean, so they going down whatever they could get from Hilly over at the CBGB's was worth it, And I could write about that. Certainly it was something most people didn't get to do.
Yeah, I mean, just the roller coaster ride that every manager must go on if they're around long enough.
Some of them have really done well. I think that it's tough to be a rock and roll manager for a lot of reasons. The really successful ones have generally been really jerks. I mean, Peter Grant, the guy, was it Zepp that he was supposed to like a thug, and Alan Klein. Yeah. I mean, and of course Tom Parker, one of the biggest thieves of all time, who basically killed the goose that laid the golden egg because of his lack of concern. I mean, I guess that's what it takes to be successful. I think my problem was I was just too nice a guy.
Now, creating believable and memorable characters, obviously that's always important. And the main character here, he's got to be somebody we connect with and want to follow along on his journey. For writers that are listening to this episode who write fiction or want to write fiction, is there advice you can give? Is there a secret to the process? Should it always have a connection to somebody they know?
Well, I think that, of course, that's the starting point. People have to understand that when you say you invent a world, that doesn't mean you invent every single aspect of it. I just gave one example. Vinnie Calamaro was a corrupt Teamsters official. Had nothing to do with the entertainment business. And this guy that I modeled probably would have died rather than, be friends with gay people and black people. He just wasn't going to do it. That wasn't how the mob flew back in 1970 or 71. Take people and events in your life and use it as the starting point. If you had a teacher that you didn't like and they did something bad to you, that could also take place on Mars in a sci-fi book, or take place in medieval times in a fantasy book, or take place in a music show in a rock book. You have to start with what you know. How can you write about people if you don't know people? What I say to my fellow writers when it comes up is every single character you ever create has some of you in them. Because where do you get these? It's from people. If you try to create a character without reference to anybody you ever knew, I think it'd be impossible even if you tried. But it'd be a very boring character. They would have no flesh on the bones, it'd just be so I think that you can start by writing about people just put them in different situations. Say, that teacher that I hate, I wonder what they would be like if they were in a foxhole in Guadalcanal. Let me put them there and see how, you can do that, right?
Well, you're a sci-fi fan. You had to and still appreciate Twilight Zone.
I love Twilight Zone.
I've seen every episode 100 times. Yeah. And those are all based on, that's why I think the show is still so good to this day and attracts new generations of fans. Like, you go on Sci-Fi Network, that entire network is filled with programming that is within the last 10 years or so. And there, in the middle of it all, are the black and white Twilight Zone episodes.
Which are better than most.
Timeless. But they're all about the human condition.
They're about the human condition. And I almost see it as he's almost Jungian in that he looks at these common templates in that's why we can relate to it. All people in the world get scared of these things. All people fear these things, and all people would react the same way. And that's what made it such a fantastic show. Everyone who watched it, I mean, we can relate to how we'd act if we thought the Martians were coming. It's just, problem is I now know every line in every show. That's the problem.
Same here. Yeah, you got to give it some time and go back to it again. Yeah. There's the novel Daisy Jones and the Six from Taylor Jenkins Reid that's being turned into a series on Amazon Prime. Would you ever want a book like this to be turned into a movie? And if so, who would you have played Jack Bernstein?
Well, let me just say, I've watched all the episodes of the show so far, and I think it's fantastic.
It's already running. Okay, I have Amazon Prime. I got to watch it then.
I have not read the book, but I have a feeling it's incredible.
Yeah.
And let me say, when I was thinking about getting agents, other writers said, forget it. Rock and roll books never sell. And I saw one book. I don't know if you're familiar with the book Utopia Avenue by David Mitchell. It's a wonderful book that takes place in the same time frame as Queensborough Rock, but it's in England, and it's a successful. They're already successful, and it's a wonderful book. It didn't sell anything like Daisy Jones. Daisy Jones sold 1 million copies.
I know, isn't that crazy?
I'm just assuming I'm not one of these snobs. If a book sells 1 million books and people liked it, the writer did a good job. I don't see how you get around that. I don't see how you get around.
For those who may not know, this is loosely based on Fleetwood Mac. Daisy Jones and the Six is like
I figured that out. I figured that out because this. I just want to add one thing though, as long as we're on the subject of Fleetwood Mac.
Sure.
I think Lindsey Buckingham gets a bad rap. He may have not been the most greatest person in the world, to Stevie Nicks. I don't think any of these people were the greatest people in the world. When you've been in the music business, it's hard to describe too many of them as greatest people in the world. I will say one thing, Lindsey Buckingham is one of the best guitarists rock has ever produced. And he makes it even better by playing with his fingers, not even a pick. And he gets
Amen to that. Absolutely.
He is so good.
Stevie. Yes.
Let me just tell you, Stevie Nicks is great.
Yep.
He's great. But you can get another lead singer. You ain't getting another Lindsey Buckingham.
I would say listen to the live version of Big Love on that 97 reunion album. Wow. Big Love, the studio version is great, but that it's just him and the guitar. Like I say, he's finger picking. Unreal.
Mark Knopfler, these guys are like at the top of their game. Yeah, so that that is as to whether there'd be a sequel, whether I'd include all. Now, as I talk about, I love talking about rock groups also,
Well, and who would play Jack Bernstein, though, as an actor? Who would you want? What does he look like? I was trying to imagine. I'm thinking dark hair. And
he's about 5'8", a little bit taller than me. I give myself a little height as well as some girls. And he has an afro, which let me show you a picture of me about the circa the time that I was doing all this, if you can see it.
Of course, incredibly handsome, I'm sure. Oh, yeah, there you are. Yeah. Yes.
I had to go to the one reason South Jamaica figures in the book is when I first started wearing my hair like that, which we affectionately call the New Yorker Jufro, I had to find a pick to be able to comb it. And this wasn't something that was called an Afro pick. It was looked like a pitchfork, and you fold it up. It wasn't something that the first time I walked into Landolfi Brothers in Maspeth and wanted to get that haircut, they said, we don't cut that kind of hair, which I interpreted to mean we don't have black people in here. So I had to go to South Jamaica to get an Afro pick. I eventually found barbers that could cut it. But, that's how, and that incident about going to the phone and trying to get directions, that was when I was trying to find the store that sold the Afro pick. Amazing the things that you remember.
Yes. Speaking of that.
Who would play it? Who would play it? Have to be a young person.
Yeah.
Not that familiar. I would think maybe somebody who maybe along the lines of maybe Jesse Eisenberg, sort of,
right.
Somebody who looks like a little wimpy, but actually isn't,
That's a good pick. But, you were just talking about that, something that made me think about in this book, there's some interesting, there's the racial aspect of this. It's these black guys getting along with this. Max is a white kid and he's stepping into this band. You got some black musicians. And like you say, it doesn't matter to them. It's a gig. A gig is a gig. But in those days, that was kind of a thing. That was a concern. Can these guys work together?
It was a big thing. And it was also, this is the thing that if anything troubled me about the book, it was this. And I actually spoke with a friend of mine, an African-American fellow who's also a musician, an amateur like myself. And I said, I'm concerned, I don't want to be some white guy speaking for black people. He said, no. He said, you're doing what a writer should do. You're a white guy showing from your perspective. And that's actually not a bad perspective. He said, there's nothing to bigot. I said, well, what I mean is, not that Jack is a bigot, but we have this scene where the black men side with Jack against the black radical because they think he's just a rich kid who's a phony. And this guy, Jack, is at least trying to make money for all of them. And he said, just like what my friend Barry said, drummers will do for money. He said, well, what do you think people will say when some rich jerk comes in and says, I've got some principles I want you to live by, but I've also got the money you don't have. He goes, they throw them out, right? Exactly what happened. He said, these are working musicians, they're not there to listen to a political lecture. That troubled me, though. And also, there was, of course, that didn't trouble me. There was the going back and forth between the Italian and the Jewish characters, but that's New York City. Anyone who lived there would know all the ethnic groups had this love-hate relationship with each other, that, they had all these stereotypes about each other and all these, perverted views about other groups. But when they actually met with them, they got along with them pretty well.
Queensborough Rock, it's out now through Crosswinds Press, and it's available wherever books are sold. You can get it on Amazon, right?
Yeah. You
got a website, too. You have a blog.
Yes.
Where can people find you online?
They can find me at www.stephenshaken.com. Or if they go to any one of the books on Amazon, they'll be able to find their way there also.
You got quite a
And,
few books, too, that people can look up in Amazon. Just put in your
yeah.
name. Stephen Shaiken, thanks so much. This was great to talk to you, and I really enjoyed the book.
Well, I really want to thank you for giving me the time to speak to you and to all the people who listen to you. It's just been a pleasure, and I just hope that you continue to do all that you're doing for us writers out there.
That's it. It's in the books.